Very our CSIC research talk, and in particular, welcome to those attending online. It's good to have you all here. It's great to have one of our newer RAs, Will Brown, who's actually working with Kristen on, remind me the name of the project, because I always get this wrong.
Up 2030. It's the name of the project. Of the whole.
What was the first bit of that?
Up
2030, that's it, yeah. Which is a European project, but that relates very strongly to CSIC's Digital Cities for Change agenda. So we've adopted Will into our CSIC family. Will started out his academic career as a sociology undergraduate at Anglia Ruskin, so very local to here, and looked at the impact of gentrification upon notions of urban belonging in the area around Elephant and Castle for his dissertation for that. He then went to Amsterdam to do a master's degree in urban sociology, which is where he first learned about smart urbanism, which is the topic of mutual interest to us. And that led into a PhD in systems engineering, but actually focused much more on the sociological side of systems engineering, not the kind of how do you tie senses together end of it.
Engineering department.
But in an engineering department, exactly, yeah. So, and you completed that this summer?
Yeah, July, graduated.
In July, and then went straight into an interview with Kristen and I to start this post, which is very relevant to your PhD, which is largely what you're going to be talking about now. So I'm not going to steal any of your thunder and talk about that. But well, it's great to have you as part of the team, and it's great to have you
so much. Yeah,
thank you.
Get started. Right, so thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. So it is basically my PhD thesis topic, my research topic, which was basically built around the development of a framework for developing holistic socio-technical conceptualizations of smart urbanism, which I have given the title SMARTEEE for reasons which become apparent in due course. So the About Me page here, as Jennifer was saying, I am from and around Cambridge, so it's very nice to be here in this department, in this university, and there's some more information about me, the important stuff, Capricorn, really important things. So before we talk about smart cities, I think it's important to talk about cities in general. So cities are things that we're all familiar with. We could all point out a city, I would imagine. We all have an idea of what a city is in our heads, but there isn't a set definition of what a city actually is because they're so complex, they're so big, and what have you. But they do have these different qualities, which I'll briefly go through throughout their entire history. So I've got two images on the screen here. One is a rendering of Uruk, which is considered to be the first city in human history in Sumeria. And this was around 5,000 years ago. A quite incredible settlement, actually. It estimates to have a population of around 90,000 people at its peak. A very long time ago as well, so really interesting. And at the bottom is a far more contemporary example of a city, which is Los Angeles, a vast, sprawling metropolis in California, of course. And the reason why I've got these two images is because these themes course throughout the cities throughout history. So cities are dense, which is something we're all familiar with, of course, the idea of them being denser than the environments around them. So not only does this mean that buildings are closer together, but also that people live far more closely, far more in each other's lives and what have you. They're also built environments. It's pretty obvious to say, but cities don't exist naturally. They are created by the hands of human beings, ultimately. They are designed, they are envisaged, and they are built by human beings. They're also resource intensive. So most cities will have what's called a linear metabolism in terms of the consumption of goods and services, what have you, where things are produced off-site, brought into the city, consumed, and then the waste is taken out. This is changing slowly with initiatives around the circular city and circular metabolism, but they do absorb a lot of resources. This is bound up as well in the impact of climate change. From cities, 57% of the world's population live in urban centres, according to the World Bank in 2023. But they produce 75% of the world's carbon emissions. So this outsized influence of cities on the world's climate change. They're also administrative hubs as well as centres of trade and economics. So cities bring people in from different areas. So for instance, if you look On a local scale, cities will be home to local like governmental offices, they'll be home to courts and things like this. And they also are the centres of trade. So Uruk in the Sumeria and Los Angeles, to varying degrees, exist as massive centres because of their influence of trade and various trade networks. Also within a city, they are mobile. In the sense of cities, as I was saying before, due to their size, you can't just walk around the city generally. So there's an importance emphasised on transportation of people and various things across the city. So being able to move across these different spaces is really important. They're also diverse, and I don't just mean in terms of ethnicity, although this is very much the case, cities are more diverse than non-urban areas, but also in terms of what people do within those cities. So the emergence of cities has also coincided with the emergence of more individualised practices, ways people earn a living, for instance, is born around with the rise of urbanism as well. And they're also unequal, a phenomenon that's occurred throughout history, again, within cities, not just today, but throughout history. And then finally, they're also contested spaces. So cities are not, they are designed, of course, in a certain sense in terms of their plan and what have you, but the uses of those spaces not necessarily for the purposes of what they were designed for. So if you think of any town centre, for instance, and people skateboarding in it, for instance, they weren't designed for that space, but because of how people live and interact with the city, they can shape it in whichever ways they want. And ultimately, these are all different perspectives of the city, some of which will be competing with others, but it just shows the complexity of just understanding what a city is before you try and actually work within that environment. And coupled with this, cities are also, in the best quotation I've come across in my studies, is that cities are processes, not products. Some may think of cities as being set places. You know, we think of Cambridge, think of punting and cycling, what have you. But they're processes. They're constantly changing, constantly evolving, and constantly growing, or in some cases shrinking. So now we can talk about smart cities, the key topic for today. And very briefly, smart urbanism is the latest, you could argue, in a train of various forms of urban management. So if you go back throughout history, you can think of examples like Baron von Haussmann's redesign of Paris, or you could think of Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities or Le Corbusier's Plan Boisson. There's different examples of trying to shape the urban environment in a way that it can be better managed and steered towards certain end goals, certain futures. Then with smart cities in particular, early iteration of it could be considered to be the urban dynamics of J. Forrester, one of the earlier proponents of systems theory and systems approaches, who looks into the idea of system dynamics as a way of managing cities more effectively. There's the idea of the Technopolis, which was very short-lived, but it's the first iteration of a project that linked urbanism with technology, particularly commercialization of technology, to improve the city. And then finally, at the turn of the millennium, the smart city really starts to come and be a tangible thing, using that nomenclature as well. So the idea of using technology essentially to enhance the urban reign. But going forward, smart cities have begun to develop, grow, diversify, and to such an extent that in 2017, Lukamura et al. Identified through a large-scale study of the first 20 years of smart city development that there are two broad interpretations of what a smart city is. There is the holistic perspective, and there is the technocentric perspective. So to begin with, the technocentric is in essence the idea that a city can be improved solely through the utilization of technology. So the technology is there to improve the city in some way, whichever end goal that may be. So, for example, got an example from Cisco at the bottom there, so from 2020. And the idea of smart city uses digital technology to connect, protect, and enhance the lives of its citizens through use of things such as Internet of Things, sensors, video cameras, social media inputs. They are able to provide constant feedback to city authorities and citizens to make more informed decisions. There's this idea that the technology itself can enhance the city through us being able to make better decisions on the back of it. Now, the other perspective is the holistic approach, which argues that rather than technology itself being the catalyst of quote unquote smartness, is that technology is one element of many within the city to be utilised, and that technology, in a sense, needs to be integrated with different elements of the city. So at the bottom here, I've got a quotation from Andrea Carrillo, who, this is the sort of the most common quotation cited for defining smart cities within sort of the holistic smart city literature. And they argue that a smart city is when smart investments in human social capital are made along with investments in traditional and modern communication infrastructure. So they identify transportation and ICT communication in particular to fuel sustainable economic growth and a high quality of life with wise management of natural resources through participatory governance. So this differs in the sense of we'll use technology as alone to improve the city, rather this is a component of enhancing the urban realm. And one example of the potential limitation of a technocentric perspective comes from Brussels, in particular an app called Fix My Street. And simply put, it's an app where citizens, residents can say if there's a pothole, let's say, or a broken paving slab, and report and say, on this street there is a broken paving slab, can someone come and fix it? Seemingly a very good idea in terms of you have a far more efficient and easier way to communicate issues with the city to the authorities and what have you. However, the issue was with this app, not necessarily the app itself, but who used the app and who could use the app. So research into this app revealed that mainly the people who were using this app were people who were more affluent, with higher education, and lived in more affluent parts of the city. Whereas those who didn't use the app were people who lived in more deprived parts of the cities and people with less IT skills. Also people who were more likely to be migrants into a city. This is particularly important for Brussels because it's a very diverse city in itself. So the issue is, if this approach was rolled out across the city, then you could have a skewed representation with that technology and therefore enhancing inequality by listening more, I guess you could say, to those who are able to use this app in more affluent areas. Another issue with smart urbanism, well, it's not necessarily an issue, but another element of smart urbanism isn't just the complexity of working in the urban environment, but the number of people or different groups involved in the smart city. So on the right-hand side here, I've got a list of different stakeholders from Cardiff's Smart City project, their roadmap published in 2019. And you can see the different ranges of entities who worked with the city in developing the project. And this is a particularly interesting element because smart cities have traditionally been built around what's called a triple helix, the combination of academia, the public sector, and the private sector. But more recently and more going on, the quadruple helix has emerged where citizens are brought in. This is a really important element of basically grounding the smart city approaches into the city context itself. But with these different expertise, there is the potential for the dreaded silo to emerge and for information to not be shared across these different groups, owing to their different perspectives, their different backgrounds, expertise, and what have you. Ultimately, within smart cities in general, according to Luca Mora, there is a risk of these two different approaches, the technocentric and holistic, diverging. Although I can see more recently that these gaps are starting to close. But at the bottom here, he argues that researchers should instead begin to search out the grounds that can transcend the gaps between the technocentric and holistic. And this is what has inspired me, or what did inspire me, to conduct my research. So in order to do this, to bridge this gap, my approach was I applied two philosophers, Martin Heidegger and Roy Bhaskar, to essentially deconstruct what actually is the smart city and use that deconstruction to then build a framework to cover different elements of a smart city project. So to begin with Martin Heidegger, a very influential but also very controversial philosopher in terms of his political leanings. He was a member of the Nazi Party. But this paper, or this essay he wrote here, A Question Concerning Technology, published in 1953, has been incredibly influential in terms of my understanding of what the smart city actually is. And within it, he argues that technology is not a means to an end, but rather is a way of revealing things into the world. So what he's arguing is basically that rather than technology just being a tool, is a way of bringing new things into the world. So an example of this that I've selected is an investigation into air quality in Accra, city in Ghana. where researchers over a period of 22 months installed particulate matter sensors across 11 different sites in 4 different neighbourhoods selected owing to their varying socio-economic status. So representing more wealthy, affluent citizens and those who live in more deprived areas. And what's interesting is not only did they uncover what would be the end goal of the air quality in that space, but they also revealed that air quality was worse in poorer areas of the city in comparison to those of areas that were more affluent. And the reason why, according to the study, was that in these poorer areas, people were using biomass fuels to cook. So wood in particular for cooking at home as well as in small businesses. And what is interesting here from a revealed perspective is that not only have they revealed that there is an inequality between the different air qualities that people are experiencing, but also the fact that this practice is unhealthy in a sense, and that is not recommended. So something that is being normally conducted every day is now, through the use of technology, been rendered to be not safe. So another element of what Heidegger would call the essence of technology is the idea that technology challenges the environments upon which it is being utilized. So this is what he calls challenging. The example he has is the idea of the Rhine, the big river in Germany, and applying a hydroelectric dam, well, installing a hydroelectric dam onto it. And for Heidegger, the essence of the river has changed from being a solely natural phenomenon into something which is part of a wider energy system, and that is then being utilized to supply energy and therefore fuel the economy and what have you. And this is happening to a certain extent within smart cities. So the example I have here on the right-hand side is the smart street light, the smart lamppost, which rather than just a lamppost being a source of light, they now are more likely to have CCTV installed on them. They have weather sensors, CO2 sensors, EV charging, the list goes on. So what the smart city has done in this sense is changed the pre-existing infrastructure to become a platform essentially to sense the environment and to produce more data. And then once something has been revealed and what have you, Heidegger argues that it's not used straight away, but rather it's stored up, waited to be utilized in the future. And this is what Heidegger calls standing reserve. So the example here I've got of felled trees. Is the trees have been cut down through the use of technology, and then they're being stored as timber to be utilized in the future. And within the smart city, the clear idea of this is data. So the utilization of data isn't necessarily used straight away, but rather can be stored in vast data sets and then utilized going forward. So what is revealed is then stored, waiting further use in the future. And then finally, the last 2 elements of Heidegger's perspective is what he calls destining and enfrainment. So destining is essentially the drive behind why certain actions are taking place. So the smart city, it could be to improve the sustainability of the city, it could be to reduce carbon. It could also, if you take it further, it could be utilized as a means of economic growth and utilizing smart city technology to enhance the economy of the city. And then finally, there's enfrainment, which is essentially that once something has been revealed, it then sets into a framework potential future actions. So once something has been revealed, let's say the poor air quality, for instance, in the city, then the authorities could then work to try and reduce that and change their approach because of what has been uncovered by the technology, by the smart city sensing. So ultimately, applying this to Heidegger's approaches with smart cities reveal insights about the city, so things that potentially have not been experienced before, and reveal them as insights to be exploited. They challenge in terms of influencing the use of certain infrastructures and practices within the city. They also obviously produce a lot of data, which is stored up to be utilized going forward. They also are built in an ambition to enhance the city in some way. So that, as I said, could be various different means. And then finally, they are enframed in the sense of enframing future actions. However, Heidegger doesn't consider where this entities that have been revealed comes from. And this is where I utilize Roy Batskar, the philosopher, and his concept of critical realism, or his approach to critical realism, where in which he argues that ontology is not reducible to epistemology, or in everyday language, there is more to reality than what we experience. So there are events that occur that we do experience, but there are a lot more events that occur that we don't experience. And this is very apt for the smart city. So to this end, Bhaskar argues there are three different domains of reality. There's what he calls the empirical level, the actual level, and the real level. So the empirical level is basically what we experience. So you're experiencing, we talk right now, we're experiencing the slides, what have you. So this is what we actually interact with, what we actually see and sense. But then there's the actual level, which is events that take place, but we don't experience them. So for instance, the Wi-Fi connecting our laptops or the working of the computer, for instance, we don't actually experience that directly. And then finally, there's the real level, which is what he calls the causal mechanisms, which underpin why these events are taking place. So for instance, this could be the reason why these lectures are taking place, transfer of knowledge or what have you. So applying Bhaskar and Heidegger, my perspective of what I would argue the essence of smart cities is the experience of previously imperceptible events, which are revealed in order to attain a set goal of vision. So in my mind, the smart city is there to reveal new insights into the city, which can then be utilized to enhance it in one way or another. And this is interesting in terms of not only the perception, but also what it means for Peter Checkland, the founder of soft systems methodology, who was influential in my research, would argue is a purposeful activity system. So these are the systems that we are utilizing and what we're achieving when we try to transform something. So the example I have here, and one that he uses, is the idea of painting a fence to improve the aesthetic quality of a house. So the idea is you, in his words, do P by Q in order to achieve R. He did initially say X, Y, Z, but changed the letters because of confusion with graph axes. So he chose P, Q, and R. So basically, do decoration by painting the fence in order to improve the aesthetic quality and the economic value of your house. By arguing the smart city, it's not do P by Q to achieve R, but rather it's do P by Q to reveal X in order to achieve R. So it's the idea of you install, let's say, or you want to understand the air quality, so you install sensor network in order to reveal the actual quality of that air to then do something about it, let's say, or to understand it going forward. So let's apply this approach to a case study, which is a bit more closer to home. So this is the Cambridge Smart Signal trial, an ongoing trial as part of Smart Cambridge. This image on the right hand here is the sensors being used in the Smart Signal trial. So they've installed cameras at top of these top traffic lights, 4 different locations across the city. This is on Hills Road. And basically the idea is to use machine learning to reduce congestion in the city along a very important part of the city, which I'll get onto in a second. Interestingly, the authorities have utilised a company called Viva City Labs, who was started by 3 Cambridge alumni. So keeping the intellectual capacity of the university in the city sphere. So what is interesting in my mind, one of the interesting things is where the sensors are located. And this reveals in a sense that the role of the smart city in many cases. So the 4 dots here, and there's one in the bottom right corner, are the locations of these sensors and where they are being conducted. And they haven't chosen this part of Cambridge randomly. It's very intentional where the spaces are, because it's not in the city centre, it's not on the outskirts, it's not in a more deprived part of the city, but it's on Hills Road, which is arguably the most important artery within the city. Because if you go north, it takes you straight to the city centre. If you go to the south, it takes you to Addenbrooke's in the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, which is the largest employment site in the city, and also is near to the train station. So this is in part because the reason why Smart Cambridge in particular exists is as a subset of the Greater Cambridge Partnership, which emerged from a new city deal signed in 2014 with the express purpose of enhancing the economic growth and prospects of the city. So the reason why these sensors are here ultimately is to enhance the economic capacity of Cambridge. So what the sensors have done after being installed in the summer of 2021, initially they would record all the traffic and road use going past these cameras. So using ANPR cameras, they would identify various different modes of transport, so from pedestrians all the way to e-scooters and motorbikes and what have you. And then over time would categorize and understand how these different forms of mobility operated within the city, identifying what vehicle paths they took, how long their journeys were, what's the vehicle speed, the origin, destination, and near misses, which if you've cycled in Cambridge, I'm sure you'd be somewhat familiar with. But then towards the end of the first year of the project, the City control agent took over from the original mode of managing the traffic sensors, which was called Scoot. And for small periods of time, there was artificial intelligence essentially running the traffic signals at that part of the city. So observed by other members of the project, but for a small period of time, there was AI running those traffic signals. And this is really interesting in my mind because it shows the degree to which a smart city is somewhat invisible to those who live within the city itself. So for those who are navigating this intersection, for those who are cycling along or what have you, it's very difficult to actually experience what is going on with the smart city there, unless you're particularly aware of the cameras on top of the lights or the little green stickers they put on there saying that your data has been collected, or if you're particularly attuned to the traffic signaling times, you may have been able to notice a difference. But generally, the smart city itself is not experienced on the street level. And this is interesting because it results in what I would term the surfacing of smart cities and the need to reveal what is actually going on through various means. So one example of this could be the cyclist counter on Parker's Piece in Gospel Place. Nearly at 1 million cyclists this year, but we'll see if they reach there. And then another example would be the smart panels. I noticed when I came in, there's one downstairs as you come into the building here, a way of showing various things like buses and road traffic and what have you. So these approaches are there to utilize or to demonstrate the data that's being collected and refine it in a way that can be ingested in a certain sense by those who actually use the city within it. And this surfacing is not only in terms of surfacing what the data has found, but also an important element of this is surfacing the different perspectives that people have within the smart city, being able to bring together these different initiatives, these different points of view of smart urbanism. And this is where my framework was born. So I've utilized the insights provided by Heidegger's work and also Roy Bhaskar, as well as different elements thought about through a literature review that I conducted for my thesis. And I came up with SMARTEEE. So I wanted a memorable mnemonic to aid people's utilization of it, and SMARTEEE, after a long time of working at it, was the best mnemonic I could come up with. So SMARTEEE stands for 8 different elements, which are, I argue, need to be considered in developing holistic smart city approaches. The first thing to consider is the situation, or basically the context from which you are looking to install the smart city or to adapt a smart city project. So would this be a problem? Is there a solution that you're looking to find, and what have you? Next thing to consider, or another thing to consider, is the makeup of that scenario. What are the different elements that are considered and how to bring those together in a holistic way? The third element is the actors involved, so the human side of things. So who will be involved in the development of the project, but also who will be potentially impacted by the utilisation of this approach within the city. The fourth element is to understand what's revealed, of course, using the Martin Heidegger approach, i.e. what original insights are going to be discovered through the utilisation of this technology in terms of the city that has been applied in. The next element is what I've called tools and techniques, which is basically the actual functionality of the smart city. So the sensors being utilised, the various technologies, and also the methodology behind applying these approaches. And then finally, there's the events and experience, which brings in Roy Bhaskar. So what is going to take place whilst these technologies are functioning, and also how they're going to be experienced by those within the project and those who are beyond its boundaries. And then finally, the enframent. What is going to be revealed and understood about the city, and how will it shape the development of the city going forward? So this was the original layout that I devised in my research. So I developed a tool of like visual aid because, as I'm sure you're aware, applying fairly niche philosophers from a niche subject in complex areas like running a city will not work. So there needs to be a way of basically translating the complex elements of the theories into something that can be utilized. And this was the original approach that I devised. I then tested the approach with 13-hour-long interviews at the 2022 Transdisciplinary Engineering Conference in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. And here I sat down and interviewed experts within the sort of field of transdisciplinary engineering and used the transition from quote unquote normal working practices to remote working during COVID as an example. And the reason why I chose that is because it is an experience that everybody had gone through at that time. So it was a degree of commonality and people could talk about it and have people. And then generally what was found by the approach was that, initially it was a fluid situation, but then was tightened up when institutions or governments mandated working from home. The actors within the project, a lot of the people interviewed were lecturers, so they said there was a real split between those who supported the process of remote working and those who needed the support to do it. In terms of tools and techniques, obviously Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and to a lesser extent Skype being utilized, but also things to consider with the distribution of hardware. So not just like laptops and computers, but also things like office chairs and supplies, enabling people to actually work from home. And then finally, also the offering of training courses for staff to be able to actually continue their work whilst working from home. Then the events and experience was an interesting lesson learned, because talking about events that people haven't experienced turns out to be very difficult. So that is one insight that has altered the framework going forward. But in terms of experience, there was a perceived increase or sometimes decrease in pressure that people experienced. And there was also a decrease in informal communication. So what one of my respondents called coffee chats. So the equivalent of talking around a water cooler at work. This sort of removal of informality and therefore the imposition of a need to talk to different people. But then finally, what was revealed in the frame was particularly interesting. So Zoom and Microsoft Teams for many of the participants resulted in an acceleration of time in the sense that they perceived their day to be busier and more intense. Another element of this was the removal of the need to travel meant that people did not have time for themselves in the sense that a sense of being constantly on. And then going forward, the enframent is the entrenchment of hybrid working. So I'm sure many of us do hybrid working, I know I do. But then also in terms of the continued use of these platforms, of course, we're using Zoom today. But what's interesting with these insights and ultimately this approach is that it has shown the link between the technology being utilized and the effects produced by it in a social sense. So these platforms were not designed, I would imagine, to make people's days more intense, for people to experience more pressure and what have you. But that is ultimately what was achieved through this case study. So as I said, one element of the interviews wasn't necessarily just to test the approach, but also to understand ways in which it can be improved and refined. So on the right-hand side here, I have a number of different suggestions that were posed by the interviewees to improve the approach. So first thing to consider is the role of this framework within the design process. Another important element was the idea of basically baking in my own assumptions and frameworks into the tool. So you'll notice here that I purposefully followed a block and arrow approach that you start off in the top left-hand corner and you go around, you start with a problem and you end up with a solution. But as we know, that's not necessarily how projects work. You can start with a solution, be looking to find a problem, or you can start from any of these different elements. So I wanted to remove that implicit approach that I had developed. Another thing to consider was how would these projects be measured, and that's something that isn't included in the framework. So also the idea of a second layer was recommended. So the idea of having a means of supporting people who use this framework. And also the idea of a tool being the boundary object emerged, which I think is really important, a way of bringing together different perspectives and different groups of people. So I designed the second iteration along the lines of boundary object. And then finally, aesthetic qualities to simplify and refine the approach and also improve the layout. So after a bunch of time after the After the conference, I then settled on this approach as the second iteration of the framework. So here you'll notice that the event section has gone because it was difficult for people to utilize. That is now a subset of the experience section, which I'll go on to in a second. And although you can't particularly see it on the screen here, there are blue, like light blue geometric shapes behind each of the yellow boxes in order to identify where people could fill it out, but they don't have to necessarily fill out a box, use the page in whichever way possible. There's also no implicit order in terms of working from things, so you could start off with a perspective of, let's say, the technologies that you have, and then go from there to consider the other elements. And then this is the second layer elements that I included. So from a literature review of various tools to assist people to think more systemically, I applied these various approaches to these different elements. So for instance, PETAL for considering the various elements of the project, the DIKW hierarchy to think about what could be revealed as a way of structuring it, and various other approaches. So penultimately, the question of when, who, how, and what, and the why of SMARTEEE is present. So these are the things in terms of when and how the project will be used. So when do I think the best time to use this tool would be? Well, within smart city projects, there are often periods where decisions have to be made, which then influence the trajectory of the project. In my research, looking into the Smart Cambridge project, I identified 5 distinct periods in the development of it. The initial planning of the project and the setting up of the various teams and what have you. The development of the initial infrastructure, so data platform, for instance, in Cambridge example. Also the branching out into other areas. So Cambridge in particular looked into autonomous vehicles as an avenue to research, which they are still doing today. Then reviewing what has been conducted before then implementing it into the city. I'd argue that the best time to apply this would be at those points of change. In terms of who should use this, I recommend that members of advisory boards, those who inform the decision makers, would be best placed to utilise this. And an interesting element of this would be through the utilisation of this framework, an implicit inclusion of the citizens in that, in order to get that broader holistic perspective, to having a means of developing and delivering quadruple helix approach. I'd also recommend that it's used in the workshop environment, either using the Delphi method of surfacing different perspectives and then combining them at the end, or in terms of collectively, so having it as a discursive piece and what have you. And then ultimately, what is produced by this approach? And I'd argue you're ultimately producing requirements for the smart city going forward. So the idea of revealing the current state of the city as it is, and then the future approaches that could be born out of that through the idea of enfrainment is, in a sense, a requirement. And then finally, why do I think this needs to be done? Well, the complexity of any smart city project really lays it bare to the potential for siloization to emerge. And this could then produce outcomes which are not contextually suitable for the city or could be improved. Therefore, what is needed, and I would argue, is a big picture understanding of the project. And this is what this is ultimately trying to do, is to bring together these different perspectives to understand what is the smart city project as a whole. And then ultimately, using this at different decision points within the project, the intention is to develop more holistic requirements for the smart city going forward. So to conclude, and going forward, Jennifer mentioned at the start, that I'm working with Kristen on the Up 2030 project with the European Union. And our role within that is, in essence, to develop a tool, although it's in its very early stages at the moment, to assist cities in managing their carbon emissions. So not just accounting them, but actively reducing them and ultimately removing them in a manner that is systemic, integrated, and holistic across the whole city. So not just in terms of reducing cities' authorities' carbon emissions, but across the whole city. So then applying my project or my work that I've done previously to this project, the importance of a holistic perspective has been illustrated here, and also devising a means of working across silos. And I don't only mean in terms of different organisations of people, but also data sets is a particularly important barrier preventing the development of urban carbon management. And also it means presenting a more holistic insight. into the development of the city. And then for the future for this in particular, as you will notice, I haven't applied it to a smart city context yet, in terms of an official project. So that is something I'd like to do in the future. And I would also, as a result of that, like to further develop this approach to make it better. So these are my references, if anyone's interested. And if anyone has questions, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.